Welcome. Thank you, Siri's cousin or Alexa's cousin, whatever your name may be. This meeting is now being recorded, so whoever's watching this post, you're welcome. I'm letting you know that. All right, so let's see. We're going to have subtitles going on this screen as well. I think that's what we're going to, does that work?
Yep, if anyone wants subtitles, they can click it at the bottom of their screen and it will auto-generate for those who want them.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily. So my name is Kyle Oldham, pronouns he, him, his. I'm excited to be in community with you all. Trying to figure out why I'm staring at myself, but it's okay. It's gonna be great. Thank you, Emily. So we are here to talk about DEI Facilitation 101, how to address and how to address important topics. It is going to be a day of good times. So glad you all are able to join us. And for those of you joining us virtually in this space, welcome to be in community with you outside of this space as well. So just to show your platform, we've been in Zoom now for what feels like 3 years. So hopefully you understand what is available to you. There are chat buttons. There's a participation button at the bottom. I know you know where the stop video button is at because obviously most of you turned that off. So that's perfectly fine. The shade, I know. And there are reaction buttons, which I know a few of you have seen as well. So those are all along your bottom. If you hover your mouse there, I encourage you to open your chat window so that you can speak into the space at any point in time and ask questions that way, whether it's either sending a private message to myself or if it is sending it out to the folks in the space. I welcome you to use your chat window. I will keep an eye on the participant window. So if you unmute at any time, I will take that as an informal suggestion that you want to say something into the space, or you can raise your hand as well. So hopefully that was a good reminder of how to use your platform. Here is the disclaimer. If you came today to get a checklist that says, I'm going to be a DEI facilitator now, I know how to address every important topic because I got check, 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 check. Sorry to disappoint you. That's not what's going to happen today, boo. It can't work that way. It's going to be, you're going to get a lot of information, hopefully, that will give you more things to think about, maybe ask more questions, raise more questions, be reflective in the spaces that you occupy. And hopefully those tools are something that you can utilize to take with you and into these spaces, but know that this is a messy, messy, messy situation that we find ourselves in. There are days when we will do it well. There are days when we won't do it well. There will be days when we should have done it and didn't. There will be days when we did do it and probably shouldn't have done it that way. But that's our hope, is that we can hopefully get us into a space where we can at least know what these tools are and what these resources can be for us. Principles of community. If you don't know about them, go up to the second floor of the LSC and read them on the wall. Hopefully you have a copy somewhere in your office. Hopefully you can type them into the CSU search engine and it'll pop them up for you as well. But this is driving our work, right? We are aspiring to make these real. We want these to be front and center for us as we make decisions, as we engage with one another, as we hold each other in these spaces, as we hold each other accountable in these spaces, as we hold ourselves accountable to the person that we say we want to be and the values that we espouse, but that they are also the values that we actually enact. So our hope is that if we can really center these 5 principles, that we can truly create those spaces where addressing these topics will be second nature, will be welcomed, will be identified, and will be also understood. And that people won't be surprised and caught out of left field because you like asking someone to explain something in a very great question that you're doing. And they're like, well, why would you ask me that? And you're like, because it's the principle of community. You should be operating with integrity. You heard? Whatever it might be. First thing, don't ever probably approach someone like that unless you have a really good relationship with them. Just gonna put that out there. Cool. Some assumptions for us. There's some societal conflict and inequity happening. It's always been happening. Some of it's been brought to the forefront even further in the last 15 months for some of us. And the reality is some of us live with it every single day. So it's an assumption that as we enter into this, that this is happening. That there are social injustices as a result of that conflict of an inequity. We're reunifying our workplace after COVID. that's going to bring up stuff for some of us, for all of us, for most of us, right? And it's going to look differently because of injustices, inequity, and conflict. I'm going to assume that we want to be better. If you don't want to be better, absolutely, let's talk about it, because I do like to diss some stuff. Okay, let's just be real. Let me take that hat off. And I hope that we are in this space because we want to be better. And as a result of being better, do better. So I'm going to talk to you all in that vein from an assumptive, I made that word up. There we go. I used it twice. It's mine now. Place that you want to be better and do better. And I'm also going to have this assumption that a baseline of human dignity is going to be considered. Now, I know some of y'all are like, not everybody has a baseline of human dignity being considered, Kyle. I know, but I'm going to assume that, right? And that's how I choose to operate and walk through this world, that even when someone is coming at me from a place of saying some stuff out the side of their neck that they probably shouldn't say, I'm going to assume that some human dignity is at the base of that. And I'm going to weed through that and figure it out. And some of y'all might say, well, what about the emotional labor? And what about all the pain and trauma that they're inflicting upon you? Ain't no weapon formed against me shall prosper. That's what I'm going to operate from. And I'm going to bring in the talk from that space. And I'm going to try to do what I can to continue to open that conversation up further so that we can continue to muddy this water, because that's how messy, as I had put in my disclaimer, that this has to be. Any questions, comments so far before I jump into your first interactive opportunity? Okay. Remember, chat window is available. I noticed that no one has said anything just yet, so I'm a little bit offended, but that's okay. I'll shade y'all until y'all do something that I need y'all to do. So first things first.
I have a question.
Yes, Brian or Jeff, which one?
Yes, thank
Jeff.
you. When you were talking about the principles of community, I was wondering, from someone on the outside looking in, like a potential candidate, how would you describe the differences between principles, competencies, and values? So we have the principles of community, we have the core competencies, our division values the most, and then we have the values of the Division of Student Affairs.
Okay. So the way in which I would explain that off the top of my head is that the principles of community is what we aspire to as a university. This is who we hope to, this is what we hope to uphold as we engage with each other, do the work that we do, and make the decisions that we have. The DSA values are what drive us to uphold and reach those aspirational goals of living our principles of community in action. And the competencies are things that we will teach you and engage with you in order for you to be able to feel like you have the knowledge acquisition and the skills necessary and the awareness necessary to live out our values and enact those, so that you can also help us reach our aspirational goals.
Fantastic, thank you.
Oh, no worries. Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate you. All right. So where we're headed today, what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to see if this works because technology is never my friend. In the chat is a Google Doc link. You should be able to edit in that. If you can't, my life will not end. We will just move on. But I hope that we can all type into this document an answer. I'll ask you to pose a question or a hope you are looking to get out of our time together today. So this way I can just see what's out there for folks, what folks are experiencing, what folks are wanting or needing. Take a couple of minutes to do so. I'm looking at the folks' faces I can see to see if it's working. It is, thumbs up. I see people in there, anonymous wombats and raccoons and kangaroos. Let's do it. This way, we will see what happens. I can give you some melodic tones while we do this. If you have nothing to add because you're like, I just logged in so my supervisor knows that I'm here and I'm not doing anything you asked, Kyle, that's fine. You don't got to tell me that. That's your story to tell. Cool. All right. So while you all are doing that, I'm going to speak to my moderator. Emily, we are going to do breakout rooms next. I'm going to ask people to be in groups of 3 to 4. The question will be on the screen coming up after this slide. And I would ask for folks to speak for about 4 to 5 minutes. Let's see if anyone drops off from me mentioning breakout rooms, because that seems to be kryptonite for humans nowadays on Zoom. Okay. All right, looks like folks are still maybe writing a few things, which is fantastic. Okay, that looks to be a good list. All right, so thank you all for taking the time to do it. It says take 2 minutes. I know I didn't give you 2 minutes because we had gotten started slightly late, and that's my fault. But you can finish that up if necessary. But we're gonna move into a group discussion. And on your screen is your group discussion. How do you engage in a conversation with an employee to help them develop? What are your approaches? What are your techniques? What do you try and why? That's the conversation I'd like you all to have. I know there just wasn't enough time. You got me started, Kyle. I know that's my goal in life. So 1 or 2 people, would you like to put something into the chat or into the space of maybe, you know, what you do to engage in conversations with an employee, maybe an approach or a technique that you use?
Hey, Kyle, do you mind if I just tell you, since it'll
Absolutely,
be quicker?
Cami.
So me and my group talked about how it's hard to get buy-in sometimes from employees. And that's something we struggle to do, is to get people to understand that it's important and that they should want to learn more about that, especially when you're working with students. A lot of times students are just in it for some extra cash or something like that. So asking them to do more beyond their job description can be a little difficult. So we just kind of talked about that and how it was different in each of our positions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. We're going to touch on that slightly, I believe, through our conversation. So good. Thank you for getting us started, Cami. It looks like invest in building relationships. Pamela, thank you for putting that in there. Know the dynamics and what the history is to know how to approach. Thank you, Nancy. Absolutely. So many complexities here. One other person want to put anything out there? If not, before we move on. Cool. Well, I ask you to hold what it is you just talked about as we go through today, because I think it's going to circle back around in a lot of different ways, and I'll try my best to call that back in. So first, I want to ask you, we're not going to do a group discussion. What's considered an important topic? Because today's session is how to address important topics. What's considered important? It's a trick question. I don't know. It's different for everyone, Cami says. Absolutely. Thank you for going ahead. I'm just going to cheat now, right? Are these important topics to you or to the other person? That's the complexity of this. If Cami wasn't trying to steal all my thunder, we probably would have went through some things like, I'm going to name this, I'm going to name this, and I'm going to name this. And then I would have said, well, are these important topics to you? And you're going to say, of course it's important to me, because that's why I brought it into the space. And then I would have said, click the button and it said, but is it important to the other person? And that's the complexity around doing this sort of facilitation and conversation and addressing topics, is that we have to remember that what might be important to us might not be known or important to the other person, but we still need, want, and desire to address it. So we have to figure out how to engage in those types of conversations. And as Nancy, as you pointed out, what are the dynamics and what's the history, right? And if, as Pamela, you pointed out, what's the building of the relationships? And as Cami, you pointed out, we're hiring, you in your position, you're like, I work with students and this is what I need them to do. And they just here for the money. They ain't here for all this other stuff. And the reality is that all that other stuff is still a part of that conversation. It is a part of the job that they're here to make that money for. And that's where we need to figure out is, how do we address important topics, not only in those moments, but we do it like we should be doing evaluations. We do it all the time. It's in the investment of the relationships. It's in the hiring process. It's in the recruitment process. It's in the one-to-one meetings. It's in the recognition that we give. It's in the conversations that we hold. It's in the team building and the group dynamics, because the reality is it's a part of us. every conversation is a DEI conversation. And so we need to understand that there's a distinction between DEI of, let me teach you, educate you, train you on all the nuances and interactions of all the people that we have, that where I'm like, Kyle, I don't know all this information. I don't know all the fancy words. There's a difference between that and the reality of recognizing the human dignity in another person and recognizing the impact that I might have on them because I do not know their story. And that is still a DEI conversation. And that's why this is so hard to say that I can't just give you a checklist, but that there are things that we have to be cognizant of and be mindful of, that we don't know everyone's story. There are things about you all in this space that I do not know. We have maybe similar stories growing up because of a similar experience. We might have different stories growing up. And so we need to know that we might say something, and it comes back to one of the things in the Google document of intent and impact, that my intention was to just build community with you, but I asked you a question that has a horrible impact on you because it brings up things for you that you never realized had that sort of impact on you. And I didn't know that it was going to have that impact. And so now I have to own that and figure out a way to navigate through that. And then also be like, that's my bad. I didn't realize it was going to be there. And then continue to learn from that and do better and be better. And then it makes that gray area of our ability to hold conversations, because then I know the argument always pushback is, well, then how am I supposed to say anything? Everything's going to get me in trouble. Quite possibly. And then we say, well, it's the other person. They're not built of stern stuff. They need to be built stronger. And it's like, well, maybe they are built of stronger stuff. They're just tired of dealing with some other BS that you never had to deal with in your life. So again, we need to recognize that each of us are individuals, that we all have these approaches and techniques and needs. And that's what makes it so messy. Because in the past, we used to just say, screw it. If you're not this one person with this one experience, with this one idea, then it doesn't matter what you think, feel, experience, or at all. You just better do these things. And up to an extent, that just causes even more problems. And so we really need to figure out how to represent and see, or how to represent ourselves the best and also see the human dignity in another person. I'm going to take a moment to step off my soapbox and see where we're supposed to go next. And it looks like, Ashley, you put in here, the master the art of asking good questions to understand their why and where they're entering into the space. Exactly. And that's going to be a one that we get to hopefully within the next 65 minutes that we have together. So, so this was going to be one of the questions that my soapbox sort of interrupted. Does your approach change because diversity, inclusion, and equity are involved in the conversation? Are your techniques and approaches limited? But once diversity, equity, and inclusion is brought in, will it change how you approach something? It's okay to say yes. That's not a rhetorical question. It's okay to say no. I do the same thing. Yes, it does. Natalie, since you said yes first, tell me why that's the case. And then we're not going to do that all the time, people, so I'm not trying to prevent you from engaging. But tell me why you think it does. If you want to speak into the space or type, that's fine.
Happy to speak. Sorry, Kyle. I was typing and then I was like, yep, you can come off mute. Forgot that for a second. It's fine. I think for me, I think about the differently than just the dynamics of engaging in conversation that I'm like always trying to navigate the way power in particular connects there. I think when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, and often like the students that I'm working with, I'm thinking about like, how do I invite people in to the conversation instead of push them out? So like, how do I, sometimes depending on the conversation, I have really strong reactions, right? I tend to be a pretty direct communicator. Kyle knows this about me. But when I'm having these types of conversations and I'm really seeking that learning moment with a student, I try really intentionally to like push some of that back. And think about the ways that I can invite someone into that conversation differently than like not engaging in a conversation, but maybe just engaging in behavior correction.
Absolutely. And I love what you're bringing in, Natalie, in a lot of different ways, because I feel like even you're like, well, I'm direct. I will go at it. What, you know, and then I try to change it to invite people in, but even inviting people in might look direct to other people. See how funny and complex this is? You're like, why do I even bother? Because if not, we're doomed, right? Science is already telling us our planet's on trouble. If we help it along even further and can't even see the human dignity in each other, what's the point, right? But how do we invite people in? And it goes back to what Ashley brought in, those asking good questions. And I like Natalie too, that if I heard it correctly, it was there are things that cause issues for you as well, right? So you have to be mindful of my own self and how I show up. So again, that's something else that we're going to get into, right? Like our approaches may change, our techniques may not, or we might just use different techniques. Our approach may not even change. We still might do some of the same things. And so again, we have to figure out what works for us and what works for the other person. And a lot of that goes back to that beginning piece that Pamela brought in, is that relationship. If the first time you're talking to someone is to let them know that they stepped out of pocket with some of the words that they did or behaviors they exhibited, yeah, it's probably going to go a little hard because you have not shown care, compassion. You have not shown any other interest in them other than constantly course correcting them. And how many of us grew up in a space, a household, a relationship, a friendship, a community where everything about us was being monitored, questioned, and course corrected? Some of that might be some socialized behaviors that we have, and now we've internalized them. We didn't like it then, so why do we expect other people to like it when we're doing it to them? We have to hold all of these juxtapositioning tensions when we think about addressing important topics. And again, my hope is that what I share with you today, as we continue to move forward, will hopefully bring some of that up, which is why I'm not going to keep asking people to engage like in person, but keep putting things in chat. That way we can all experience the thoughts, processes, and ideas from each other. So let's be real. As I said, DEI is in every conversation. It is a spoiler alert. Sorry, it is the episode of this week. You just found out the end game. Okay, cool. All right. So where we're headed, we're going to talk about what's facilitation, tips to consider for facilitating, some self-awareness pieces, and some tips to remember. As I looked over what you all put into the Google Doc, for those of you that might still be in there, you're looking like, wow, it looks all different. So some of the topics and themes that I hear coming out of that is people want to know how to engage in these conversations. So my hope is that we're going to cover a few of those pieces. And some of it came in with how to address moments that are triggering. So we're going to try to talk a little bit through that as well. And again, can't give you all the answers, but I can share some of my experience. And I hope that you all put things into the chat that will sort of liven up the conversation and add more complexity to what we bring up. How to start conversations is a piece of it. So how do I get these conversations into them with my staff, and how they might be difficult conversations to hold. How to hold space in people and experiences, right? Because we want to care for others based upon their self-identity and not make them do all the work. And I want to be able to hold conversations with coworkers and colleagues on topics, and I want to be able to de-escalate. So all of these things are very complex. And again, it would take probably 2 weeks for us to go through everything, but we're going to try to touch on things that will hopefully lead you to other spaces. And if you have resources that you've seen or heard, please feel free to share those in the chat so that we can all benefit from that learning together. And then last piece was some tools and strategies for facilitation, and to be able to support folks through their own self-discovery. So my hope is that we can cover these areas, these theme areas, as we go through. And my hope is to call to those as they show up through this agenda that has been put forth. So first and foremost, what do you fear when facilitating a conversation related to DEI? Nothing. Taking a second for people to type, find the return button. Offending someone, thank you, Cammie. People leaving hurt feelings. Yeah. Hurting folks, getting myself in trouble. Thank you, Doug. Yeah. It's fascinating that when we talk about this, the first piece is not wanting to hurt someone. And we don't want to hurt someone as a response to someone already being hurt. Think about all that, right? So when these things come up, or when something occurs, someone is probably hurt or could be hurt, or future hurt could be done, because if they're talking to you and they didn't hurt you, but you're like, that could hurt someone else. It's all about harm, right? And harm is at the center of this. And it's fascinating that this is what we center ourselves in some ways, or some of the things that we first come to mind for us is not wanting to hurt folks, or people think I don't get it and not trusting me anymore. Absolutely. So even breaking of some of those relationships because you're not addressing it. That's cool. An attempt to bring people together, dividing further, miscommunicating, or offending, right? That a lot of this is centered in hurting someone. And then sometimes the first response that people have is like, well, you're just too sensitive. It's fascinating how we have to hold that, right? And so a lot of it is, again, going back to Ashley Grice's comment around master of asking good questions and figuring out and sort of playing some of those strategic games of like, let's talk about what just occurred and what could have happened from this. Let's play the what if. So what would have happened? What could happen? What did happen? And really asking those pieces, right? So if this is the fear that we're centering ourselves in, this is going to sometimes sort of wrap itself around how we enter into the space, which means we might enter unsure. We might show up in a space where we don't know the right things to say, where we might sound, our tone doesn't match what we're actually trying to do, which then shows to other folks that we're unsure of the next steps to go. And so we need to figure out a way to dismantle some of this fear, or to at least acknowledge the fear, right? Sometimes it's just acknowledging it and being like, hey, I want to stop and just take a moment and let's really talk about what just occurred, because something came up for me and I'm curious if anyone else recognized it, right? Jess, did you want to put something into the space? Saw you unmute. Sorry, I'm a unmute ninja. I see it happening. Okay, cool. We're good. So really figuring out what the fear actually represents for us and what it means. And is it something that just sits there for us? Or is it something that we just acknowledge and are able to walk through and say, this is what I'm carrying with me, to just know that it's there, to be authentic in my response or in my engagement. Yeah. Anything else came up for folks? Driving someone away from the conversation of the group, being misunderstood and babbling. Yeah. Creating a space for folks to feel heard. Yeah. So hopefully these are some of the pieces. Opening trauma, that's a good one, Sonia. Yeah, like we don't know what trauma is for folks, right? Trauma to me is going to be different than Emily, it's going to be different than Jeff, it's going to be different than Cammie, right? Than Caitlin. And so what we always practice and what we always learn to do, our tool, we can't just pull our toolkit out and say, oh, this is the step I'm supposed to go through, because again, every person is different. So we have to know and navigate some of that. And sometimes our best tool is, I'm so sorry that that's occurred and that happened. What would we like to chat this through further? Would we like to talk about this, right? Sometimes we just have to say, I'm sorry, right? And start from that, because that sometimes is a great validation tool and technique to open the conversation further. Oh, so I'm going to get into some technical things here, right? Because that's what we're supposed to do in institution of higher ed. So we're supposed to do technical things. And my hope is that as we talk about this, you'll see how it relates to the things that I've asked you to think about around your fear of entering into a conversation, around your techniques and your approaches, around what it is that you want to learn today. So what's a facilitator? A facilitator balances listening with comments, so they should be structured so that they can foster general discussion. And when we say facilitator, like, it's not just in a group setting always. You facilitate meetings one-on-one, right? So think about how you balance your listening with your comments. I right now am not facilitating this dialogue. I am more lecturing, maybe teaching, and maybe even training. Facilitation, slightly at those moments when I ask you all questions that you don't want to answer, but that's okay. I can answer myself, it's fine, right? Another thing around a facilitator, avoid taking sides, right? So if you are in a group situation and you're facilitating a dialogue, try not to just always lean in on one person. Even if you know you're like, I am in alignment with you, right? Try not to acknowledge that, but try to keep a neutral stance and make sure that your other folks are being heard. A lot of times we're like, well, I don't want that person to speak because they're going to say a word that offends folks. But if they don't have a voice in the space with a contrary point, we might not get further and we might not be able to bring that person along either, right? And it's hard, right? We don't need every word in the book being put into the space, but maybe there's a concept that they're not understanding and we have to create a space where they feel like they can be brought in to be able to discuss. And maybe you bring that in. If you see someone hesitant, maybe you say, okay, well, what happens if someone doesn't agree with this? And since you might have the right words to acknowledge that, as a facilitator, you can bring in that contrary viewpoint, right? Because someone else might not be comfortable, like Emily in this space might not be comfortable to say, well, Kyle, what about this, right? She might not be comfortable doing that. So I might then say, well, what about this. I might bring it in as the facilitator just to see what other people are thinking and feeling, because that person might need to be heard in that space and they might never have had a chance to dialogue and get the information necessary. And again, there's a balance, right? Because we can't always center a contrary view. And we also know that contrary views can also create tension and harm and trauma. So we have to balance and figure out what's good for us and what somewhat might be good for the group. And also some of that learning, because that's where we most learn sometimes, is when we're leaning into some of that discomfort too. So it's a double-edged, triple-edged sword that we have to sort of balance around. And last, I believe this last one, is that a facilitator seeks examples. When people mention abstract issues or discuss things in fairly general terms, how do we seek and pull out some of those examples? Maybe going to what Natalie brought in, right? How do I bring someone in and ask some questions for further detail? Because if someone's like, you know, well, we all just feel this way, that milk is better than soda. Give me an example of how milk is better than soda, right? That's a bad example for me to use, but that's the first thing that popped into my head. I don't know if that means I'm thirsty or what, but we're going to work with it, right? We might invite someone in to sort of break down that very abstract issue, that very general term. A lot of times I like to ask people to say, speak from your own experience, use I statements, right? Because I don't need you assuming that we are on the same page, right? Those royal we's and those royal you's separate us from the conversation. So how do we allow ourselves to be a part of that? Here's a math equation. Don't tell any mathematics that I'm saying this, but this is my math equation. Supervising plus facilitator plus X equals U, right? We need to know that as the supervisor, you are going to need to be facilitating spaces, right? You need to be able to have not only these facilitating opportunities, but as a supervisor, as part of that development, they go together. That X is that variable that we can never account for. So sometimes we just have to know that a variable is going to be introduced and be ready to be shifted, to have to adjust and to be flexible. And all of that makes up you in the role that you're in. And even if you're not a supervisor, if you don't wear the hat of a supervisor, call it mentor, call it coworker, call it colleague, whatever word that is going to resonate with you the most, that might not be supervisor, it might be mentor, what have you. You still have some of those developmental pieces that tie into facilitation as well. You can make more coffee drinks with milk. Thank you, Caitlin, for bringing that up. I had no idea. I am not a coffee drinker, but I hear that you can do that. All right. So some things that a facilitator is a motivator, a guide, a questioner, a bridge builder, and ultimately sometimes a trainer and a developer at times. You might have to slip into those roles of trainer and developer. A lot of times as a facilitator, you're motivating a space. You're motivating people in the space to speak up, to learn, to engage with one another. You're guiding them through how to actually have dialogue or to think or to process. You're questioning things so that way people can learn on their own, and you're not just always writing out the answer and giving it to them, because that's not going to help them. It's those transferable skills that we can then utilize as a great keyword, Cami, when we're talking to those students who are like, I'm here for my money. Don't talk to me about this. And you're like, well, this is going to be a transferable skill, because what you want to do in the future, what kind of work that you want to do, you realize you're going to have to work with humans at that time, right? And if you're working with humans, you're probably going to need to learn how to communicate across difference. So you might want to listen to this because it's a transferable skill. I'm helping you out. Now, as I said, you probably don't want to clap at people, because some people that just brings up some other feelings and thoughts, but I'm just trying to drive that home with us in this space today. But then that last piece of that trainer and developer, a lot of times training is separate from facilitating, because they overlap and they oscillate with one another, but they're not always hand in hand. And so sometimes you might need to slip into some of those roles in a space when you are just needing people to do what needs to be done. And I see the LSC Coffee Shops leader speak into that space. There you go. I'm going to get your advertisement, get you some public vocal radio announcement. I'll send you your invoice later. Cool. So, question about this mathematical equation that is really not math.
I think not a question, but I love what you're bringing up, because it feels very connected to education, right? So like somewhere else, maybe this looks a little different. I hope that in a lot of places it looks like this. And we are in the context, some of that X variable is the university setting, right? That
Mhm.
they're learning here to go out next. And so we have a bit, I see myself in the supervisor role as an educator. And I know that the folks here are considered that as well. So I just love that connection in being brought up.
Absolutely. Thank you. Cool. So if we think about it, stop cheating, Emily. So if we think about it, happens. We then say like, well, where are all these spaces? And I sort of gave you a cheat sheet earlier when I talked about as a facilitator, we facilitate in multiple spaces, right? We facilitate in multiple ways. And so some of that can be one-on-one meetings or our evaluation meetings. We're facilitating a dialogue. We're asking questions. We're listening. We're reframing. We are posing contrary viewpoints. We are motivating that person to be better and to do better. We are highlighting and being mindful and reframing for them what their experience may have been so far. If you don't currently hold one-on-one meetings with your staff at least once a month, but again, depending upon the work that you do, it might be something to do because that's how you build that relationship. If you work side by sides with folks, I'm going to go with Kate because that's where I see Emily bringing that in, or unless that's only reserved for friends, then I'll still say Caitlin. If your work is around coffee shops and coffee making, and you're like, I just work alongside my folks and I do motivational things with them, at the start of their shift, and halfway through we do this, and at the end of their shift I say bye and check in to make sure that's still a one-on-one, right? You're getting to know people as you work together. So just know that these spaces are very malleable and adaptable, but they're where you build those relationships, because it's more easier. I'm just gonna say the bad grammatic language. It's more easier for Emily to call me in because Emily and I have a great relationship. Emily could probably snatch my soul. And while I might be a little hurt, I'll be like, okay, I see what you did there. So let's talk about this. Thank you so much for doing that, because I know it's coming from a place of care. My feelings might still be hurt, but it's coming from a place of care. So all of us in here saying like, I don't want to hurt someone. I don't want to hurt someone. If there's a relationship there, because we don't have a relationship with everyone, that harm might be mitigated, or that hurt could potentially be mitigated in different ways. Can't speak for everyone, but for some people it might be. If it's a random person that you're engaging with, yeah, you don't have a relationship with that person, so it's going to look different. So leadership team meetings, if you have groups of people that you meet with on a consistent basis, facilitate supervising in those spaces, bringing up those X factor places to really look at places that you can facilitate. Customer service interactions, you're facilitating an interaction. This is those one-offs where that person is just meeting with you in that one moment. Might be a little bit harder to call them in. It might be a little bit harder to course correct them, but maybe role modeling looks differently, or asking them questions. Say, can you tell me what you mean by that? Because I just want to make sure I'm responding to the question that you're asking. Because sometimes if you ask someone to repeat something stupid that they said, yep, I quantified it and judged it as stupid. I certainly did. Talk to me later about it. If you ask them to repeat what they actually mean or develop it further, usually they're going to use either different words or they're going to say the same thing. And then you could say, if they use different words, they're probably caught up like, oh, wait a minute, I probably did say something wrong. And then you could say, thank you, because what I thought you meant was this, but this is what it sounded like. If it's the flip side and they say the exact same thing back to you, then you could be like, well, okay, that's what I thought you said. When you say that, this is what comes up for me. And I just want to make sure that that's what you're intending, because that seems kind of harmful to me at the moment. Right. So again, depending upon the level of customer service and interaction that you have and the ability to talk to someone, use your words and your phrases to be able to engage. Classrooms. So if those of you in my space here who are teachers or have the opportunity to teach, or even in class, taking a class, you have the opportunity to facilitate dialogue. One person speaks into the space. I'm a little confused by what you just said. Can you help me see how that relates to the topic that we're talking about? I really appreciate it because I want to learn. You're playing a little bit coy in a way because you really know what they're saying, but I like to call it playing stupid, but I know that that word doesn't always fit in people's lexicon the same way, because some of us have been trained and told you should never use that word. For me, it's something that I like to do. I'm just like, I don't know what you mean, as a other person in the group, because the facilitator might not realize, the faculty member might not realize, the staff member at the front might not realize that what they said could come off in a way that has multiple meanings and definitions. Committee meetings that you're in across campus, again, you might not have relationships with those folks, but this might be another space where you facilitate learning and ongoing learning. And I believe there's no more. So just know that these are the right, there's no more. Sometimes the space is closed off. But these are the things that are places that we can practice these skills that we're about to get into. And again, I'm keeping an eye on the clock because we only have 42 minutes. So here we're about to go. So skills. Skills to use, bridging. So the concept of bridging is really bringing in information and reinforcing ideas. So if you've heard something earlier, such as I've practiced already today, like earlier you said this about asking good questions, that's bridging, to remind people that it's important to what we're talking about and that it ties back to someone else's first comment or a comment that they made earlier. The way that people feel validated and heard. It's a way for us to really connect through those threads that talks about how this is all interconnected and that it's not just a one-off learning opportunity. It's a way for us to recall and really discuss and dive deeper into previous situations. So bridging agendas sometimes, for those of you that have meetings where you have a space that's dedicated for us just to have meetings, bridging items from previous meetings or discussions is a great way to keep that track going and making sure that that thread is connected. Bridging is another great way for you to practice and show that you're actively listening, right? So the next time Sonia and I meet, and Sonia told me all about her Care Bear collection, the next time I meet, I'm gonna be like, Sonia, you know, I was looking on TV the other day and they had a Care Bear commercial and it reminded me of what you had shared with me and the Care Bear stare, and that you had the Care Bear with the heart on it, with the rainbow on it. And I really liked it, but then I saw the one with the rain cloud and that one really just took my heart. Sonia is now like, oh my God, he remembered the Care Bear stare. And I'm looking like, you're welcome, right? But that is a great way to build relationship. We do it all the time, right? We do it through text, we do it through talking, we do it when we see our friends. We're like, remember that last time when you said that? We do it all the time. So that's the thing that doing it with intention around DEI can be bridging conversations and topics together and bringing in information that someone else might have shared or that you are then introducing into the space. Climate setting and sustaining ties back to the relationship building that Pamela, you first talked about around inviting, building relationship. But climate setting can look different based upon the space that you're in, right? It can be as technical as everyone wear name tags. Let me go through ground rules. Let me tell people where the restrooms are so folks know where to go when they need to take a break. It can be all of those housekeeping items, sort of some of the things that we did earlier, like climate setting for the Zoom space that we shared earlier. But sustaining it and setting it could also be utilizing each other's names when people are speaking into the space. That way people are feeling seen, heard, and a sense of belonging is being increased. It could be clarifying the purpose of our time together so that people know why we are in this space. It's cultivating a brave space, right? I know a lot of times people want to say, I want to do a safe space. It's a safe space that you can talk. Safe is such a connotative, objective and subjective word, right? Safe means so many different things in a lot of ways, because safe can shut down conversations. The minute someone says, I feel unsafe, usually that's my word to go in on, because then I'm like, oh, really? Tell me how you feel unsafe, right? I'm probably not the best example of that because I am that direct communicator that's going to needle it in. But how do we create brave spaces where people feel brave to explore their emotions, to explore their feelings, to explore their history, to explore their interactions, to explore their own learning, right? How do we frame that as a way for people to be brave to step into the space? And I don't necessarily like it as a challenge by choice either, because then people are like, well, I'm not going to challenge myself. I'm going to choose to do this, right? I think that brave concept that Aro and Clemens introduces in their writing is really around setting up a way for us to be brave and whatever brave means to us. And then we can bridge that through and be like, hey, let's be brave for a second. What's one thing? Let's have people write this down, or, you know, a way for anonymity to be in the space too. But let's be brave and talk about something that's always confused us or something, right? So we can also use that as a technique to help address important topics without singling people out where necessary. And let me just say it again, because I'm gonna probably say it later. Singling people out sometimes needs to happen, right? We just never know. It's a feeling. And sometimes climate setting and sustaining it means we might have to interrupt the current trajectory of the conversation. If it's going off the rails, I might need to step in as a facilitator and say, look, okay, looks like there's a lot of energy around where we just went and where we're about to go. And I want to make sure that we are staying on course. So maybe we need to bring up this for a parking lot moment so we can come back to it if there's time. Or it seems like we're really getting off the conversation because we're now making it personal. So can we bring it back to what it's about, which is this topic at area, and let's think about what's happening from each of our perspectives that created this dynamic, right? Sometimes we need to narrate, right? Use your best Morgan Freeman impersonation if you need to. Sometimes we need to narrate what's happening in the room so that people have a moment to breathe and take a step back and think about it from an outside perspective. Cultivate an atmosphere, so setting up ground rules, I mentioned that, showing interest in what's being said, be aware of your body language, right? For me, my face will tell stories that I don't even realize my body can't cash a check on, right? Because I'll be sitting, someone say something, I'll be like, and I don't even realize I'm doing it. So sometimes we need to be aware of our body language because it can shut down conversations and create dynamics we're not looking for. But we can also show interest, and our body language can also invite people in hopes that they feel a little bit more sense of belonging, of sharing. Being in space with folks, you'll feel energy differently, right? So here, I can't feel your energy. I can't just walk up next to someone and make someone uncomfortable. Sorry, I do that too. But at least when we're in spaces with one another, you can definitely feel the energy differently. You can pan bodies, you can pan tone differently. And you can just sort of be in the space and understand and see what's happening without assigning judgment to what might be going through someone's mind.
Kyle,
And then, yes.
can you describe
Panning.
Yeah.
I knew you were going to ask that question. Why do I know you so well? So panning is pay attention now. It was introduced, I believe, Kathy O'Bear maybe, or one of the people that I've read it from. There's a few other people that have had it in their information. But what it is that you pay attention now to what's happening in the moment. You're observing things that are occurring. So if I see that someone has their arms crossed and they're leaning back, I'm panning that their arms are crossed and that they're leaning back. What our minds like to do is assign judgment to what that signifies. Our minds typically say, and because research has talked about in communication studies, that if someone's arms crossed, they're closed off, they're not very inviting. If someone's leaning back, it means that they're not paying attention, or that they're skeptical, or that they're not in agreement with what's being done. And that's me assigning judgment to what I panned, which was arms crossed and leaning back. It might be a total different story. They just might be comfortable because their arms being crossed allows them to keep the blood flow circulating differently. It just might be a comfortable space for them. Leaning back is actually just a way for them to just be in the space, and that's the way they think. So it's about asking and engaging to understand what that might mean rather than just assigning judgment. Does that help? Cool, thank you. John, what about tone and volume? Do you ever amplify your voice as a facilitator, emphasize a point? All the time. For me, as you can even see, I even clap, whether it's one hand or two. That's a non-verbal way of emphasizing it. But tone and volume, absolutely. Right? You can play with that to an extent. And I've also been told in other spaces years back that me raising my voice in a space and getting excited actually was fearful for them, because they lived in a house with men who raised their voices in anger. And so that was a trauma triggering point for them. And I was like, oh, I had no idea. And so me getting excited, my voice sounded similar to what their trauma point was. So again, attention piece there. I think volume and tone, speed, pace, all of those things all can definitely allow you to emphasize a point, and the intersections of what that might mean for your identity as a facilitator based upon who's in the room, who you're speaking with, and what you're talking about can create some complexities there. I like to play with all of these things because it's multiple learning styles. It's multiple learning styles and processing styles that will allow to be able to play into the space. And I just get really excited over things. So I start speaking really quickly, and I speak really quickly anyway, and that's just what happens. So good point though, John, I love it. Allow for silence. The one thing I don't do well, right? And you're like, yes, Kyle, we can see that, but I'm also on a time limit, so I have a way to be excused from that, I guess. Facilitator privilege, but how do you allow for silence, right? We always want to jump in when there's a pause. And as a participant, right? Because sometimes we can be participants, allow silence to sit there. Allow someone's story just to sit on the air. Sometimes I have to count to 10 in my head. And sometimes when I count to 10, I'm like 1, 2, skip a few, 10. Okay, let me go in next, right? But how do you give space for silence to exist? When people bring things in, just be like, yeah, thanks. And just let it sit there. Or ask a question and let it sit there. Again, depending upon your time and the space that you get to control, is a skill to use. Silence can speak volumes in some ways, and sometimes silence can involve collusion. Right? So that means that by no one saying anything, people actually agree. And is that a good thing or a bad thing or an indifferent thing? So, and how do you speak to the silence, right? Sometimes you might come back in after silence and say, I'm hearing silence, so this might mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So you might explain what that could mean and say, this is how I'm interpreting. Let me know if I misinterpreted what that silence is represented. Because then someone might say, actually, no, that's not what that represented. And if you are a mean facilitator like myself, sometimes I will purposefully interpret silence incorrectly. So when I say it out loud, people are like, no, 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 that's not it at all. That's not it at all. And then I got someone speaking into the space, because then I say, oh, then tell me what it is. It's, oh my God, thank you so much for correcting that. I really appreciate you speaking into the space. Yes, strategic manipulation can be okay as a facilitator. Let's just own that as well. People are like, Kyle, you are so mean. I don't even know why I came to this. Okay, so some processing pieces. I like to use this process that I'm going to share with you that has been adapted from a few folks from Skills for Facilitators, as well as Keys to Processing. I believe I have their references at the end. If I don't, I will add them before we send this out. But I like to look at head, heart, and hands. And the reason why I like this model is because head is where I like to live, because it's like for me, it's the thinking, right? Heart is what the feeling is, and hands is what are you going to do with whatever it is that you came to a conclusion about. These are just a handful of questions that you can use when you're processing. So what happened in the situation that caused the reaction, and how do you word these differently within that statement? Like, what were you thinking when you stated that? And I've given some examples of that earlier. So if you want to keep heady, because sometimes keeping it in the head allows people not to feel right away. And that's why we like to start there. So then we can move into and transition into, so how did it feel to experience that? Particularly if it's someone who said something, or someone who we are trying to recognize, we were like, hey, this is what you did and this is what occurred. So we try to say, so what did it feel like for people to experience that? That way they can hear some of the feelings that have come up for others in the space. Again, without trying to single them out for doing that, and maybe sometimes it needs to be. And then that hands is, okay, so now that we've talked about this and we've talked about what it felt like and what you think it meant and what it represented, what do we do with this information? And as a facilitator, you can just navigate that in and out and sort of feel it out, that once people have shared their thoughts and their feelings, you could then say, okay, so what does this mean? What's our takeaway? Where do we go with this information? What do we need to do next? What are things that you need to be successful with this information? Because you don't have to have the answers, right? And if someone asks you something that you don't have an answer to, you can always turn it back around to the group and be like, so what do you all think about that? Right? And buys you some processing time, or you can then come up and say, you know what, I don't have an answer, but I'd be more than happy to listen. I'd love to hear what other people are thinking and feeling about this. So with processing, we have to provide time for it. We know that some of us process quicker than others. We know that there are some folks who need to think about it some more. So based upon the conversation and the topics, you might be in a processing situation with someone, and based upon your relationship, you might say, hey, so let's come back to this in the next time we meet, or let's pull up our calendars and see if there's some time tomorrow or in the next few days that we can revisit this conversation, because I want to think about this some more. And it's not just singling people out. Like, I'm not going to be in a conversation with Emily, and Emily, I realize I just keep picking on you, but that's fine, I guess, right? I don't know. And so you signed up for it. There you go. So Emily and I could be in a conversation, and if I notice that Emily needs more time, I could even own up to it and just say, you know what, Emily, I'd love some more time to process this conversation we're having. So can I ask us to find a time in the next couple of days for us to get back together and revisit this? Emily might say, nah, I'm good. I don't want to talk about this more. Or she might say, sure, yeah, that'd work really well, because she really wants that processing time. And then I'm actually creating a sense of belonging and a great relationship between the two of us, because she might have that, and she's like, wow, he needs time to process too, and he's considering my processing time, right? So there's some win-wins there as well. Thoughts so far as we enter into our last 28 minutes? Yes, I'm keeping track. Structure, linear, thinking.
I was just thinking about John's comment about tone and volume, and in the head, right? Like, some of this takes so much emotional intelligence and like reflection of your own, right? Because like, it sounds totally different when you're like, well, what were you thinking when you stated that or did that action, versus what were you thinking when you stated that, you know, like that judgment that can come out. And so I was reading that and being like, ooh, so I think having that and then having someone like Kyle and I can have feedback conversations about like, all right, you were witnessing this, like, how did all that land? And that can be really powerful too, to have like feedback about your facilitation as you're getting more comfortable with this.
You know, Emily, and when you said that, what came up for me too is the funny part. It's funny, not haha, but like funny, interesting part for me that came up was how tone and volume have been assigned value based upon a structure of whiteness, as well as based upon a structure of maleness and what's appropriate in the space, and how you are supposed to use tone and volume and when it's not appropriate to use that. And even in, I think, D'Angelo's work thinking about white fragility, how tone and volume of someone potentially crying or getting emotional in a space, which is welcomed in a lot of ways, but what's the meaning behind why that is occurring, and what that, and is that person even aware that what they're doing is creating tension in the space because how other people are interpreting what's going on. And so therefore it's asking a question, and then I might feel attacked because you're asking about my volume or my tone, when in fact I'm just trying to clarify to understand, are you trying to derail this conversation, or are you trying, or are you truly emotionally distraught over what's happening? And we don't maybe have time to process this as a group, but what can you do to figure out how to process it? So it's like so complex, right? The perception can be everything when taken. Yes, absolutely, Nancy. Perception is everything. If they're already sensitive, and what does sensitive mean, and who gets to define what sensitive means, right? How many times have my female-bodied cisgendered folks and my non-gender conforming folks been told you're being sensitive when you're like, no, I'm actually not sensitive. I'm upset with you, and I'm allowed to be upset because me being upset is not the same as you defining what sensitive means, saying that I'm just being emotional, right? Like, and there's so many ways in which that can be done. Sometimes facilitators don't even know what sensitivity level is until, yeah, it is, and that's where that apology tool is the best. It seems like we've stepped into something here that I don't know what's going on, and so I'm going to apologize for not recognizing what just happened. So do we need to spend some time here? I know that there's some visible people who are upset. Do we need to take a quick break so people can recalibrate and reconnect with their center self, and then we come back together, right? So it's utilizing all those tools, like using all caps to yell. Absolutely, absolutely. Sometimes I'll put like if I had the hand emojis, I'll be like all caps now, like I put a clap in between because that's me yelling. Okay, cool. You all didn't ask that question, but I shared it again. Facilitator privilege. So some situational considerations, right? So there's a real-time situation in using processing and some of those skills that we talked about. And the real-time situation could be in this space right now, right? Someone could bring something up and then we need to address it, right? Whether it's answering the question or someone said something or did something and now we're dealing with it. But in that real-time situation, it looks even more different because it could be in this group setting, as I talked about, or it could be in a one-on-one setting. And so we already have to now think about what's the relationship? How much time do we have together? Will we be able to follow up? Is this important enough that we have to stop the conversation now because we need to really truly address this? Or is it something that I can mention and say, hey, I'd like to follow up with you after the group if that's okay, right? Or can we put that towards the end? And again, we have to feel that out. And the hard part is that as a facilitator, it might not be as important to you, but someone else in the group is like, nah, we need to talk about this now. So we might have to sometimes just open the floor and say, hey, would like to give a few minutes to this because I sense the change in energy. Even if I'm the only one that sensed the energy, I'm still sensing my change in energy. So when we think about group versus one-on-one, those real-time situations can be real. And if it's not a real-time situation, it could be a following up on a real-time situation, right? So we can then follow up on an incident. It could be, let me follow up and ask this question. We need to set this time up. And then that's where we're going to bridge back and say, hey, back at this day, this is what was shared or this is what was said. Let's make sure we're using those real examples to tie back in and then say, okay, let's talk about what this meant or the impact it had or the potential impact that it had. And the follow-up can be in a group setting as well, or it could be in a one-on-one setting, again, depending upon how the incident occurred. A lot of it comes back to if your bubble guts, that's what I like to call my gut system. If the hairs on the back of my neck or my stomach are telling me something's wrong, there's typically something wrong. And we need to figure out how to address it. And if you don't want to be the one that says, I think this is wrong, then how do you bring it up and utilize those mastery of asking good questions to say, something is coming up for me, and I'd like to have a further discussion about this because I'm not sure what it is just yet, but I feel like we should talk about it. And hopefully the facilitator will allow that to come in, that voice to come into space. Maybe the facilitator is saying that, or what, there's a member somewhere in the space that is able to bring that up, and then we can talk about it either in real time or follow up. But something, usually our physical response is that fight, flight, or freeze response is telling us that something's not right. And sometimes we just need to work through that. Okay, so personal preparation, here's where I was gonna do a breakout room, but I'm looking at my time and not sure we can do it. But I was gonna ask you all, what are your processing needs and how might you prepare yourself for these conversations, right? Because a lot of times you need to know yourself entering into these conversations. You just can't walk in willy-nilly and be like, I don't know what makes me mad, but I'm gonna just talk about everything. Really understanding who you are and continuing to learn what comes up and what throws you for a loop and what questions are hard for you to answer in the moment, or questions that you need to have more time with, are things that you need to prepare. Sitting down and journaling, sitting down and documenting, thinking through it, talking to yourself while you go for a walk and just figuring out what causes me the most angst are things for you to acknowledge and know, because that helps you as a facilitator. It helps you as a supervisor. It helps you as someone who's going to engage in some hard, difficult conversations that are important topics. And what preparation do you need, right? If you have the opportunity to prepare because you're following up on an incident, that's fantastic. If it's a real-time situation, you might only be given 10 to 15 seconds to prepare. But if there are transferable skills and tools that you have developed for yourself, that might help you be more prepared, right? You might be able to engage in those conversations because you're like, okay, cool. This situation might require these 5 tools. Let me just pull those out and be ready to go in on that. And I will say that asking good questions is always one of those tools that should be your go-to. And then what information or support do you need? So information could be things to learn, or support could be another person. It could be information as well. Could be a space that you need that you feel the most successful in. Just thinking around what it is that works for you is also helpful in your preparation. Now, oh, one more, sorry. I thought that was a breakout room question, but it's not. What is your desired outcome and how might you get there, right? Even knowing that and preparing for that might be helpful, particularly in the follow-up incidences. If your desired outcome is for this person to at least just acknowledge that there's a potential that what they did was harmful, that could be a big ask. But if that's what you're working towards, then you can prepare yourself as to what type of questions, what example you might need to bring in, what information you might need to have at your disposal. If your desired outcome is just to listen to the person, then you might come in with certain prompts and questions to get you to that point as well. And then if there's an opening for you to see that the person's like, you know what, I never thought about it that way, then you might jump on in there and be like, oh, so tell me more about what are you thinking now, right? So it's those prompts and those one-liners that can help you find those preparation pieces as well. Whew, take a quick break. Okay, 15, 19 minutes, there we go. All right. So I was going to have you share a personal approach that you take that proves successful or helps with your confidence. I want you to think about that. 25 seconds, just think about it. What's a personal approach you take that proves successful or helps you with your confidence? Cool, 25 seconds. John, we're going to get to that in just a second. So thank you for bringing that in and looking ahead. And Ashley, absolutely. I love the elevating curiosity. It's such a better way of phrasing playing stupid. So I appreciate you bringing that into my life. So there we go, elevating curiosity. Start with, tell me about that. Yes, Nancy, okay. Admitting ignorance and desire to learn. Absolutely, Doug. Yeah, so all of these things work for us. And in certain situations it will. And when you start overlaying some of this piece of insecurity and I'm gonna say insecurity, if you overlay that with positionality hierarchy, it creates a whole nother level of like, oh my God, am I allowed to not know an answer as a supervisor? right? Because we always have this built up notion that everyone who reports to me thinks that I have all the answers. And we know that that's not the case. We laugh at it. We're like, there's no way. But yet it sometimes bubbles up for us. So we have to figure out how to be okay and be authentic and vulnerable in a space of admitting our ignorances or our lack of knowledge about something, and sort of figure out a way to bring it to the forefront for us. So what might we need to consider to hold these types of conversations? And when I say this, I think I put the comma in the wrong spot or the pause. How do I say it? What topics might we need to consider to hold these types of conversations is what I was trying to say. I don't think I put the comma in the right spot, or a comma at all, as you can see on your screen. And here are the list, right? Power dynamics, location, time, topic, pre-communication, meaning what have we talked about before? What's our previous talking points between each of us? Role of the person in the situation, right? So were they the offendee? Were they the offended? Were they an observational person who's realizing they may have been offended through your conversation? Were they engaged with you? Were they engaged with someone else? Previous experiences with the person, so that any relationship you have with them, any knowledge that you have. Personal identities, it's at the bottom of the list, but it infiltrates all of these things. So how do they show up? How do they identify? Where are they from? Because all of those pieces could then impact the conversation you're about to have. And that outcome wanted piece, right? My goal I would love for every outcome to be that someone learns, changes their mind, and goes out and teaches the rest of the world how not to say those things ever again. I know, very high in the sky, right? So how do we come with some real live outcomes that we want, that are tangible, that are measurable? So when we think about setting goals, they're specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and tangible. Do the same thing for some of our outcomes in these conversations. It's setting goals. So one concept is holding multiple truths, intentions, right? The reality is a good person can say something shitty, right? A good person can have good intentions and still have a harmful impact. And so many times we want to live in this, I'm going to use this term intentionally, we want to live in a binary world of good and bad, good and evil, when it comes to actions that people do, but we don't want to be seen as binary individuals. Think about that. Right? And I'm not just referring to identity and expression of our gender, but just in the sense of we don't want to be seen that way, but we hold others to those standards, right? People can say something really bad and not actually be a bad person. And people can say something really bad and be a horrible person, right? And sometimes we don't know what their story is and what their background is. So how do we hold multiple truths in those tensions for a little bit, at least, to explore more, to see where we're going with the conversation? And that's what the role of a facilitator can do. It's those contrary views. Yeah, in the back of your head, you could be calling them every name but the name they were given. But as a facilitator, maybe you can hold and dig further and see if all of that, what you want to say to them, should be ringing true. And so we need to figure out how do we do this, particularly around DEI topics, because it becomes so cantankerous with how we've shown up over the last few years and societally over however, because we need to figure out what's truly happening beneath the surface and what's going on. And it's not at the expense of, thank you, add awareness of privilege, absolutely, yeah. It's not at the expense of someone's harm and trauma, because it's not about not seeing that. It's about trying to uplift that someone was harmed, and the person doing it may not have known that they actually did it. Doesn't mean that we let them off the hook. Doesn't mean they're a horrible person. But what are we willing to explore and dig into to ensure that what our outcome is going to be reached, our desired outcome can be reached and looked into? Again, we could do a whole nother 7 hours on multiple truths and intentions, but I just want to acknowledge and name that this is a part of the work of facilitating, right? Those contrary views and holding them and balancing that listening and understanding that some folks like to use the term grace, if that works for you and resonates with you, that let me give some grace to this person, that what they intended may not have been what they really intended, but the impact is real. So how do I hold both of those? Intention and impact is a multiple truth and attention point, right? And so how do we hold all of that and navigate that? So discovering the power of and, oh, look at that, I love it. So discovering through dialogue is some of these pieces here. So how do we ask questions? We've heard this multiple times, elevating curiosity, asking good questions. Like, the power of asking a question is putting the work back on the other person to explain and explore further and do their own learning and reflection to provide an answer. If they're not getting it, then we know that asking questions is not going to work. But we then need to explore differently. That's when maybe we need to do some storytelling from our perspective, or invite some other people in to say, hey, what do other people think about what's being done, right? Validating contributions. I love to tell people to validate contributions as we facilitate, because it allows the person to be heard. But all because you validate someone's contribution does not mean you agree with them. Emily could say something so out of left field, and I'd be like, thank you, Emily, for sharing. Now, my tone and volume in that moment, you could probably hear my sarcasm because you know me well enough, but I'd be like, thank you, Emily, for sharing that. Are there other points of view that came up for folks as we are talking about this, right? But I validated Emily, so at least Emily wasn't shut down in that space, and therefore Emily might be willing to explore further. Because the minute I said, yeah, Emily, that's stupid, don't ever say that again, Emily's not gonna speak, Emily's gonna feel harmed, hurt, ain't gonna wanna speak, and Emily's probably is the one who needs that work to continue to explore, right? So we have to figure out how to do that. And there's the navigating and the compounding of identities in all of this, right? So if, as Emily as a white identified person and myself as a person of color, me doing the work to draw that out of her, but as a facilitator and educator, I signed on to do that work. So maybe not a person of color in the room doing that work, but maybe the person in charge of that room doing the work. Again, figuring out how to navigate all of those tension points. Being perceptive. Yes, John, were you gonna say something, or you just unmuted?
Yeah, quick question. Thanks, Mute Ninja. Yeah, do you always validate contributions? I'm just kind of struck on the, like, what if it's a personal attack or from somebody from a hate group that clearly has an agenda and they want to, like, I mean, would you still say thanks for that contribution? And I kind of struggle with that as a facilitator.
No.
Like, when do you, like, interrupt it and just be like, hey, that's a personal attack, you know, like, you've just violated community guidelines or whatever. Like, how do you navigate those kind of waters?
Well, I think it's a both and, as always, the power of and. Now, when the examples that you shared, I giggled because, like, sometimes I would be like, I'm like, thank you for sharing that, because what I'm about to say to you is about to go really hard, right? Like, I mean, sometimes I'll use that thank you and really do it so shadily and passive aggressively and aggressively. I don't really know how to denote that in a way to engage. And sometimes I won't say thank you for sharing. If it is a group that's a hate group and an attack, it might be something like, so I'm going to ask you to remember what our guidelines were at the beginning of this when we started. You just directly violated that. Let's talk about what made you think that it was okay to do that, right? Like, first of all, I'm going to ask you to apologize. Second of all, we're going to take a break and I'm going to have a conversation with you. Like, there's a lot of different ways depending upon the perception of what's happening and what's going on. If someone is being deliberately out of pocket, yeah, I might just be like, yeah, we're going to stop right here. We're going to take a quick break and I'm going to have to talk to you for a second. Come on over here, right? Because I feel comfortable doing that. Someone else might want to do like, okay, this isn't right. Let me just say this now, and let me just explain all the reasons why this is wrong and do something different, right? And it depends. Sometimes people don't get grace, because if you know they're intentionally out there doing it, yeah, I might not provide them grace. I have told some people who have called me out of pocket on certain words and phrases. I have them like, oh my God, thank you for sharing. That must be so hard to hold that ignorance for so long in your mouth. Do you want to talk further about this? Right? And then I start my clapping, which tells them I'm not about to play, right? So sometimes it just depends on who you are and what you can do. But yeah, I agree with you, John. Validating every last contribution is not helpful. But sometimes, or not, but sometimes, and it's figuring out when it is helpful and when a validation, because even you addressing what they just said as ignorance is still, I'm validating you that I heard you, but I'm not going to thank you, because a validation doesn't always have to be a thank you as well, because it can be certain types of words. So hopefully that clears it up even more mud. And Emily's like, hold your mouth, because she knows I only have 8 minutes. I get it. And then I'm going to ask folks to stay in it and focus, right? Because a lot of times we want to run, or people want to run away. And it's like, so how do we stay in it and focus on what's really happening and what's going on? And there's multiple tools that we've talked about briefly. that are probably in the next 75 slides. Who knows? I don't know how much time I have left. Maybe I'll just keep talking once the session is over, and then we can finish the recording that way. But to stay in it and focus and really ask each other what's going on and what's happening. And sometimes we can do that because we have the time, and other times we might need to call an audible and figure out how to move into different spaces. And again, based upon the relationship, if it's a one-off person that you're just coming across, and like I'll use CSU terms, you're crossing them on the plaza, you might not ever see them again, right? So there might not be as much care and compassion being used in that space. But if it's someone who works with you, it's in your circle, or it's someone you see on a more consistent basis, there might be a need to stay in it and focus differently and center that care and compassion with that equity-minded lens. Or it might be calling in reinforcements, right? Nah, I can't handle this. Let me call Kyle, he'll clap it out. Absolutely, let me sit down and talk to that person, right? Call in reinforcements sometimes can also help. And that person who you're calling in, because I've had people say, well, Kyle, I don't want to put this labor on you. I will let you know if I look at it as labor, right? Like if Emily's asking me to do something, I will say, Emily, I don't have time to do that right now. Or I'll say, Emily, I can do this, but I can't do this, right? Or I can say, Emily, by all means, send it on up, right? So I'm also in control of when I'm entering into spaces and how I enter into spaces without someone telling me what I can handle and what I can't handle. So again, something to be mindful of as a tool. So addressing behavior in the moment. 5 Ds of intervention, some ways to be direct about that. So ask a question, wait, why is that funny? Educate, so it actually does, so actually that doesn't mean what you think it does. Relate in, yeah, I thought that once too, right? That's where privilege can really be good to connect across for folks, or a common identity to be like, yeah, I once thought that too, and here's what I've learned. Confront, sometimes it is that, come on, that's not cool, try again, nope, I don't like that. So again, that confrontation piece might be necessary and warranted. And then for those of us that hate confrontation, then you might never use that one. Assume the best. Hey, I don't think you mean to be offended or to offense or to offended. I will knock the person who I copied this from that they didn't type that in there correctly. Values. Bottom line, we all value respecting all, right? So sometimes tying it back to the values and bridging that in, great, it works well. And then self-interrupt. Call yourself in on it, right? Oops, did I really just said that? That's my bad. Let me rework that, and let me just acknowledge and sit here and sit in what just occurred, right? So sometimes these intervention methods are also very helpful when facilitating spaces. So I was gonna ask you to think about some of your fillers, but I can't, so I'm gonna keep moving. So here's a whole bunch of questions that you will get afterwards that are for critical reflection, right? About yourself in relation to others. And these are all things that that have been pulled from multiple sources, such as fierce conversations, difficult conversations, critical reflection methods and theories, but really to think about, where do you situate yourself in this conversation? And the most important part is about centering yourself in what you have done. Because so many times we want to blame the other person or someone else, and we don't always see ourselves as part of the issue in the conversation as a facilitator, or as just a human, or as a CSU colleague, or what have you. So sometimes we have to think about, in a situation, what occurred, and what was my role in that? And what did my privilege identities do with that? What did my subordinated identities do with that? Where do I have agency to change this? What about the intersectionality of the folks who I am engaging with? What about my intersecting identities that are up for me? Like, all of these types of questions, if we can start answering them, will allow us to navigate what kind of conversation and what kind of movement forward we can do with action, and in the sense of what needs to be addressed and what can be addressed and what can I start doing differently. So definitely spending some time with these will be important, because they can definitely help with thinking through scenarios at a more distinctive level related to center DEI and my own self as part of the critical reflection process. Yes, if you're going to leave, please click on the evaluation and put all 5s if that's the good one, or 1s if that's the good one. So, what to know? So identity matters, and it informs everything that we do, right? We've talked about that. Every conversation has a DEI conversation. Even if you're just like asking someone to do something, right? We don't realize the DEI impacts that could show up, that what that person is dealing with, right? Even with myself and Emily, as I keep making comments about us, like, we have some distinctive differences that you can see. Black male identified, white female identified. As a male asking cisgender female identified individual something, the way in which I ask that with my tone and volume could bring up something of some internalized oppression or some issues of subordinated identities with dominance issues because of growing up in the society that we have around inequities and injustices, right? Emily saying something to me could have an impact on me as a Black identified person, right? There's so many things that could play into that that might not be our mean. Again, intention and impact. And it's not about telling us that then says, well, I'm just not going to say anything, but it's about acknowledging it in the space and maybe even checking in. Hey, Emily, was that cool that I asked that? Or I want to ask this and it might come across different. So please let me know if that's the case. Invite in self-feedback in the moment, right? Knowing our hot buttons. And I think we've talked about that. And John, I think you brought that up earlier, which I said we come back to, is the triggers that we have, right? Our hot buttons. Triggers is based in psychological framework, and there's some true trauma that's tied to some historical moments in our life, which can be different than some hot buttons. And so you can hear both of those words being used. But for me, I like to use hot buttons. What gets us under the collar? What gets you about to say, oh, no, they didn't? What are those moments, right? Because that is something we need to know and be able to work through. It's not always about you. No matter how many times I say it as a beautiful, wonderful Capricorn, it's always the world centers around me. It's not always about me. Sometimes it's about other people at those moments, right? But I can still pretend it's about me. But when we're saying it this way, we're saying that the person could be upset with you, or the people that could be talking and asking questions might not be directing it at you. It might not be about you. If you've ever had a one-on-one conversation where someone enters in at 100 and you're like, whoa, all I asked them was how they're doing today. Guess what? It's probably not about you. It's probably about the other things that they dealt with that day. So how do we make sure that that works and figures that out? And then support and challenge can be held, right? And I always encourage it, right? I truly believe that you can't always just support and not challenge. And you can't challenge without support, right? Find a way to blend the two together. Because even in supporting someone, how do you challenge them to see, to move, to navigate, to understand, to step back into it and do the confrontation that they need to do for themselves? How do you support them to see themselves as that whole human being with the dignity that they possess? And how do we sometimes challenge others to see some things differently too, right? And so challenge and support is a wonderful multiple tension point that I like to hold always, because even in the greatest of things, like, oh man, that's so great. Yeah, and think about this. That didn't work for everyone, right? So I leave you with those, I believe. I would ask you all to take with you, how might you use this knowledge and apply it in your role? What's something you heard today that you know you need to dig further into or continue to learn about and listen to? Those are the pieces that matter, because those are those hand moments. And we go back to processing. When I say hands, that's what are we going to do? Listening to all of this is great. Thinking about it's great. Feeling it is great, but what are we going to do and take with us? And with that, I say thank you. Yes, I say thank you.
If folks could use their reaction buttons or throw up some appreciation. Nice job, Kyle. Please give it up for Dr. Oldham for that. Some folks are asking me, Kyle, if we can expect to see these slides from you. That's okay. All right. So I put in the chat the attendance link. If you fill out that attendance link, you will get access to the slides. I also took a couple notes at the bottom of said Google document because it felt easy and accessible and expanded on some of Kyle's brilliance that we were able to capture. Thank you, Kyle, so much.
One word, because it's on the takeaway learning slide that I forgot to cover because I put thank you in front of that. Acknowledge the progress that you make and the learning achieved, right? And measure yourself against where you've come from and not against the ideal, because I think that's what prevents us from engaging as well, is that we always think I'm not where everyone else is, or I'm not at this ideal space, but notice where you've come from, because it's those small incremental steps that will get you to the place that you have an ideal of yourself for. So those were the last things that I wanted to say.
There's a little part in those notes of like powerful one-liners. That's an example. So Dr. Oldham, Kyle, thank you so much. We hope folks will join us back at 1 o'clock if you're interested in how you can utilize these skills. We're going to be talking about Everfee and what CSU may expect from that in the coming future. Let's see, Kyle and I also have a feedback session on Thursday that dive into some of the stamina that this work takes, and would love for you to consider joining us as well. For those of you still with us, appreciate you, and we hope to see you throughout the week. Kyle, thank you again.
You're welcome.
If y'all want to say, come off mute and say bye. I love that. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Kyle.